We go there. I have a question for Balaji. You are, in my opinion, but I think a lot of people would say, one of the most incredibly well-read, thoughtful, commentators that we have. Frankly, not just in tech, but I just think generally in our society. I would give you that. I think you're incredible. I'm curious, how did you become such a polymath? Was this just one of these things where you've always been curious about everything? Just tell us about, I'm curious about how you grew up, first of all. And then second, how do you spend a normal day? I just want to know those. And then we can just jump in. I'm just curious because I find you extremely well-read and extremely knowledgeable.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I try to learn from everybody. What do I do? I think normal people go to the club or they go out and have fun. And I read math books and history books and science books and stuff like that. That's how I have fun. I find that more interesting. Nothing wrong with going out. People do that. I go for walks and stuff. I work out. But so I do a lot of that. Other than that, I just read a lot, and I think I remember a moderate amount, and so I cite that.
And for people who don't know,
it's something really much more complicated than that, but that's it.
I think we call that a polymathatia.
The only difference, Chamath would be you if he could stop going to the club. And so he lost that last 40%.
I will make an observation, which I was actually talking to Sacks about this, which is there's some people who are great at business and learn the tech because that part is necessary to put it together. And there's some people who are fundamentally like scientists or academics and then get into business in order to advance technology. And there's nothing wrong with the first group. And I think that's totally, fine and legitimate, like business people first, and then they get in tech. I'm really part of the second group, I think, where, I'm fundamentally an academic at heart. I spent almost the first 3 decades of my life meditating on mathematics, and just kind of got into tech relatively later in life than many others.
All right. And you spent your career building companies. Everybody remembers Earn.com, 21.co.
By the way, that's actually doing extremely well at Coinbase. Coinbase Earn is on track for 100 million revenue. Actually, it's much more than that in terms of GMV. It's broken out separately in their, not their S1, but their quarterly filing. So you can go and check me on that. And the other assets that we added after I joined Coinbase are more than 50% of Coinbase's revenue, again, in their filings. And Coinbase custody and all of its assets come from Rosetta, which is something that we did there. And we launched USDC when I was there, and that is whatever, $100 million a day. So they got a lot of value out of that acquisition.
And you were the CTO for a while of Coinbase, obviously. What was your take on Coinbase's Lend product? The SEC coming in and saying, hey, pump the brakes. We want a bunch of information. And then Brian Armstrong and Coinbase announced that they're not going to do the Lend product. What's your take on that?
So I don't speak for Coinbase anymore. Okay. I'm, in my personal capacity. But I do think that this is sort of the beginning of an era where we're going to be rolling back the alphabet soup that FDR put in place. That is to say, the SEC is not set up to go after millions of crypto holders and developers. They're set up to go after a Goldman and a Morgan. Just like the FAA is not set up to go after millions of drone developers, it's set up to go after Boeing and Airbus. And the FDA is not set up to go after millions of biohackers. They're set up to go after, Pfizer and Merck. So the entire 20th century alphabet soup, that regulatory apparatus, is meeting something that it's not really set up for. And it's going to be, the problem is not any one actor like Coinbase or Kraken or what have you. Their problem is that technology has shifted and they've got many more people to deal with. And many of those are individuals who are more risk tolerant than companies. So I don't think they're going to be able to maintain the status quo of 100 years ago, the statutes that they're citing. I think that's going to either get knocked down in court or going to be technologically invalidated. There's going to be sanctuary cities and states for crypto, or there's going to be international entities like what El Salvador is doing in Switzerland. So I don't believe that era is going to maintain, but I think there's going to be a big conflict over it. So we'll see.
How do you think it's different this time, though, Balaji, to the crackdown? Because folks said the same thing going into kind of the Napster era when, everything was basically peer-to-peer sharing of media files that were technically copyright. And there was, some regulatory regime that, had oversight over that copyright. But then the DOJ got wrangled in and they went in and they made an example out of arresting a couple hundred kids, I think. And it basically caused everyone to back away entirely from the market. It's similar to kind of what we may be seeing happening in China right now. But is it not possible that we see a similar sort of response this time around where they kind of take this targeted, make an example approach to kind of scare people kind of out of the frenzy that's I think driving a lot of people onto these platforms rather than going after the platforms themselves. So kind of saying, look, this is a violation of securities laws. You guys are getting prosecuted. Here's the 100 examples. And suddenly 80% of the attention kind of gets vacuumed out.
Yeah. So I'd say a few things about that. First is, I think 2021 is different from the year 2000 in the sense that China is an absolutely ruthless and very competent state. Whereas the US government, I would consider, it's a difference between lawful evil and chaotic evil. Do you guys know that from Dungeons and Dragons? Okay. So the Chinese government is lawful evil. They are very organized, and they plan ahead. And when they push a button, they just execute like this whole of society, and they don't leave round corners or things left out. The U.S. government is today in 2021, not the 1950 U.S. government. The 2020 U.S. government is like this shambolic, chaotic mess that can't really do anything and is optimized for PR and yelling online. And that's a whole important topic. But so that's one thing where I think there's a difference in just state capacity. But that's not to say that they're not going to try with what they've got. The other thing is that, so to your Napster point, there was thesis and antithesis, but there was synthesis. That's to say, Napster led to Kazaa and LimeWire, and actually the Kazaa guys went and did Skype, so something legit came out of that. But the more important or more on point thing is it led to Spotify and iTunes. The record companies were forced to the negotiating table.
There was a waypoint there that's important, which is that when that happened in Napster, we ran a company called Winamp, and it was part of AOL. The biggest architectural flaw of Napster was
Whip Salama's ass.
Yeah, and the biggest problem with Napster was that it was not fundamentally peer-to-peer, and so there were these servers, and so the simple software architecture decision that somebody had to make was, okay, well, let's just make a entirely headless product that basically is fundamentally peer-to-peer, and that's what the Nutella source code was. We actually released that on AOL's servers without them knowing. It took them a few hours to figure this out. They called us. We shut the whole thing down. But in those few hours, it was downloaded about 5,000 or 6,000 times, all this open source code that we put out. That was the basis of LimeWire, BearShare, and that is what basically just decapitated the music industry. And it was there that then the music industry realized we needed a contractual framework to operate with these folks because they'll just keep inventing technology that makes this impossible. And then that's what iTunes was able to do with a 99-cent store. That's what Spotify was able to do after that. But a lot of it started was because of what Balaji said earlier, which is that technologically, people just will continue to push the boundaries. And we did that in music. And I think that's a lot of why the industry looks the way it does today.
But ultimately, the premise kind of resolved back to centralized systems, right? I mean, like, think about the Napster concept. It was really supposed to be true peer-to-peer file sharing, and it ended up becoming the iTunes store where everything sat on Apple servers, and they ultimately served everything out.
That's the reflexivity, because like what happens is all of these folks, you're sitting at Warner Warner Music or Universal Music Group. You're seeing an entire industry that was worth probably $20 or $30 billion just getting completely decimated. And then there's this psychological thing that happens where first you want to shut everything down. But then because there's this other thing that is even more evil and even worse and uncontrollable than the thing that you hated, then you actually say, well, listen, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so then you say, well, fine, let's find a few partners to work with and we can try to find a way of living with these technologies. And that's going to repeat, to your point, Balaji. Crypto is probably now where we're going to see it play out first, because that's probably the most important intersection of individuals' desire and a regulatory framework that's outdated, where the SEC has some extremely complicated questions it needs to answer, especially even after something today. Like if you're sitting inside, the SEC, and all of a sudden you see that China, an entire country, that basically was where an enormous amount of this crypto activity started and originated and was happening, can completely turn something off, what is our position as a government and as a society? We don't know.
Well, let